Hey, it's great to be with you this morning. I am so excited to be here. Just briefly, if, it's kind of interesting. I have all kinds of friends that are pastors of churches, and I say, how are things going? And they say, I don't know. And I go, how many people come to your church now? I have no idea, but it seems like there's a lot of new people that the Lord has brought in. And so, it's great to be here. If you don't know me, for the last 20 years or so, I've had the opportunity to travel the globe, and we have ongoing projects in Baja California. This last year, we were able to complete our volunteer base there. We can house 75 people. We brought in over 300 people this summer. We built 9 homes. We worked on all kinds of various projects. People just living in absolute squalor. If you want to see some of those, squalor, I should say. If you want to see some of those pictures, you can follow us on social media. But we continue to run our coaching programs for at-risk kids here in the Sacramento area, and continue to produce. We've gone around the world, spoken in 40 countries and 40 states on suicide, depression, civility, and human trafficking in public schools. Obviously, a lot of that kind of thing has moved online. I won't spend too much time talking about that, but also in Nicaragua, we've taken part in, somebody from Nicaragua has taken part in 25 different water projects there. In Zambia, almost 800 kids in schools, started a church there, our first water project there. The thing is this. God is up to incredible things. He really is, and I'm really excited about that. Really quickly, too, if you want to go to, I'll put it on the screen here, but I've written a book. I'm almost finished with it called Everything You Know About Jesus Is Wrong, and we're actually releasing a chapter at a time online. The first 3 chapters are up, both in audiobook format and for some of you, and also in reading format. I believe that the person of Jesus, who our culture, not only our secular culture, but our church culture, has taken the edges off, twisted the message, so many things, and created a familiarity with the person of Jesus and the message of Jesus that isn't actually completely accurate to the message of Jesus. I said in the first service, I'll say it again, I have never personally been to a church that Jesus could be the pastor of. A little scary. You imagine, here's a guy that just did all kinds of crazy things. I won't mention all of them, but his disciples brought a guy to him and said, this guy's blind. Jesus spit in the dirt and made some mud with his own spit, rubbed it in the guy's eyes, and said, go wash it off and you'll see. He did, okay? Now that guy was happy. Everybody else stood around and said, that was crazy weird, all right? So his disciples must have talked to him, because they brought the next guy to him. They said, don't do that again, Jesus. They brought the next guy to him. He just spit right in his face and said, wash that off and you'll be. So, I mean, I'm not just, also keep in mind, he's like 33, unmarried, weird, right? This guy, you have to be careful with this guy, Jesus. And so I titled my book, Everything You Know About Jesus Is Wrong, 21 short chapters, because we know that changing the way of thinking and changing a habit takes a minimum of 21 days. So that's kind of what that is about. I'm really excited about that. If you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Student Reach Inc. at Facebook. You just put whatever in front of that. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, it'll take you right there. Hey, would you stand up with me really quickly this morning, and we are going to pray. I would love it if you repeat it after me. Say, Dear God. Dear God. Oh, you can do better than that. Say, Dear God, Dear God. I'm so glad I'm here. And God, today, you can say whatever you want to me. I'm listening. I mean that. So mess me up. Challenge me. Get in my business. I'm listening. All right, you can be seated. And if you just lied to God, you're in big trouble. I got to tell you right now. The story I'm going to talk about today is probably one of the most well-known stories in all of the Bible, probably the most well-known story of Jesus. But it's actually precipitated, like so many of Jesus' story, because somebody asked him a question. In Luke chapter 10, 25 and 30, it says this: a student of religion came up to Jesus with a trick question. Teacher, what do I need to do to earn eternal life? Notice he wants to earn eternal life. So Jesus, answering him not from the real perspective, but from his perspective, says, you're the scholar, what does the law say? Love the Lord your God with everything you have, your emotions, your religious passion, your physical energy, and your intellect. You must also love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. Jesus answered, sounds like you already know. Do all that and you will live forever. Knowing, of course, you can't do all of that because we're messed up human beings. Okay, the man said, looking for a loophole, but what is your definition of a neighbor? He says, hey, I can do all that love, God stuff, no problem. When you start talking about loving my neighbor, I'm going to need to know a little bit more about that. As he did so often, Jesus told a story to answer the question. We'll read it in a few minutes, but Jesus goes on to tell the story of the Good Samaritan. But it's this question about who is our neighbors. Now, I got to tell you, I have had some crazy neighbors over the years. Anybody ever had some crazy neighbors? Yes, it has been kind of nutty. I have a neighbor currently who, when we had a fence between us, we kind of lived both in a field out in kind of the eastern part of North Natomas, and when a fence needed to be repaired, we took it out, and I took my tractor and I smoothed it all out before I had the new fence put in. And I had piles of dirt that I had brought into my house, and these people, everything got a little crazy for some reason. And I came out one day, and a guy, my neighbor, was digging a hole in my yard at 5 o'clock in the morning. When I came out and said, why are you digging a hole at 5 o'clock in the morning? He called the police on me. And the police literally called me up. I don't know how they had my number. They called me up and said, hey, your neighbor? I said, yeah. They said, he just called the police. They said, we don't come out when he calls anymore. I said, what? They said, yeah, we know this guy. He's nuts. We found your number. Crazy situation. A month later, I got a letter for $10,000 demand from a lawyer for stealing dirt from my neighbor. Now, I don't know how much you think dirt is worth, or how much they thought I may have stolen, or why they would have thought I was, into looting their loam. But I did not steal any dirt from them. I was just trying to make things better for them. And when I called the lawyer, I was all like, if you get a letter from a lawyer, you get a little uptight, right? You're like, eh. And I called the lawyer and I said, hey, what's the story with this? And she said, the story with this is your neighbor is crazy. And I said, wait, you're her lawyer. She said, I'm still a person. Your neighbor is nuts. You said, your neighbor did not even want to give me their last name when they hired me as their lawyer. And I said, yeah, but you sent this letter. I said, what should I do? She said, I'd throw it away. I said, wait a second, you sent me the letter. She said, what do you think I do for a living? I'm a lawyer. They paid me to send you a threatening letter. I did. I would throw it away. These people were crazy. But that's not the craziest neighbor situation I've ever had. When I lived in Napa, California, I was a youth pastor, and I didn't make a lot of money. I don't know if you know, but youth pastors don't make a lot of money. And I was living in Napa, California. So our 2-bedroom apartment was too expensive for us. So after a year of being there, we moved into the worst neighborhood in town. We moved into a 525 square foot duplex. And it was like the 1-bedroom and kind of the indoor-outdoor carpeting, the kitchen from the 60s, garage, and then the neighbors next door. And as we were moving in, the garage door popped open next to me, and this guy came out to help us. His name was Barney. He was about probably 50 years old, give or take. His dental care over the years hadn't been great. He didn't have lots of teeth left. He was wearing a Raiders shirt that had one sleeve cut completely off and the other sleeve only partly off. I'm pretty sure you can buy it like that at the Raiders store with a pizza stain, okay? And so he came out, and listen, I don't know why he was a Raiders fan. I always assume when I meet a Raiders fan, my first question is, oh, you're a Raiders fan. Where'd you do time? And so, and usually they say, Folsom or Lompoc or something like that, but no, if you're a Raiders fan, I'm sorry that you're a Raiders fan. But he was a Raiders fan, and he came over and he started helping us. And as I looked in the garage that he came out of, there were posters all over the wall. And either he was like studying for his medical exam, or he just really liked ladies with very little to no clothing, okay? And I had all these junior high boys, and I was just like, okay, let's form the line right over here, the little box brigade that went through the whole thing. And it was just, it was crazy. And he would borrow tools from me, and I would never get the tools back. And
we moved from a 2-bedroom apartment into a 1-bedroom apartment, and so I was getting rid of all kinds of stuff. I would put a box of trash at the curb for the trash people to pick up, and he would go and get it, and he would take it into his place. And then people showed up all the time, and he would exchange something for money with them. And I told my wife constantly, I said, I think he's like a small engine repairman. She said, he is dealing pot out of the garage, okay? And I said, your thing makes more sense. But there was a day when I went to get borrow a tool from him. It's my tool. I went back to get a tool from him, and I knocked on the door of the house, and this lady answered the door. And I said, is Barney there? And she said words back to me, I'm assuming, but it sounded more like mumbling to me. I looked at this little lady. She probably weighed 85 pounds, soaking wet. She was just wearing kind of an old muumuu that looked like it had never been washed, looked like she cut her hair with a lawnmower or a weed eater or something. She had like one tooth in her mouth, and I could not understand a word she was saying. And as I walked away, I'm like, I'm in some sort of movie. I'm in some sort of weird situation. I went back to my wife, and I said, Barney wasn't next door. I met a lady, might be his mom. I don't know if it's, maybe it's his older wife. She looked like she was 80. I don't know what's going on. This is a crazy situation. The pastor of the church came over, and he said, what is going on? I heard about your neighbor. I heard about the naked women on the wall. He goes, this is crazy. He said, none of the people in our church, our upper to middle class church, he said, they're not going to let their kids even come over and hang out with you. And I said, look around. It's fine. There's no room for them here in this 525 square foot apartment. But that was the kind of neighbors that I could afford. You don't get to choose your neighbors. And it was just kind of one of those crazy situations. And when this guy comes and he says, who's my neighbor to Jesus, he's asking for a specific reason. Now, Jesus had already addressed in his most famous sermon ever, I told you this is his most famous story, but his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about this. And one of the things he says this, actually we have it there in Matthew chapter 5. He says, you've heard people say, love your neighbors and hate your enemies. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for everyone who mistreats you, okay? He's quoting the book of Leviticus 19:16, sort of. Now, God had all kinds of rules in the Old Testament. If you look at them, some of them seem pretty harsh. If you mix certain fabrics, death penalty, okay? If you committed adultery, death penalty, all right? If you were disrespectful to your parents, death penalty. That's bad if you're a teenager, but can you imagine being a parent, a teenager in that situation? Where they're like, Mom, I don't have to. No, done, right? But among all of that, it tells us in the book of Leviticus, in those laws, it says you have to love your neighbors. Now think about this for a second. A little bit of a crazy situation because a lot of the neighbors of Israel wanted them dead. Okay, wanted to come in and kill them and burn their bodies and carry off their women. It was not a good situation. So how exactly do you deal with this? So the commentators, over the 1,200 years or so since that was written between that time and Jesus, they figured it out. They said, well, yeah, you got to love your neighbors, but you hate your enemies. So if somebody is living close to you, but they want you dead, they're your enemy, and God sometimes even say, hey, go wipe those people out. Well, the only way that can make any sense is you can say those people, they might live close to us. They're not neighbors, though. They're enemies. And here's the interesting thing. Most of us, when Jesus says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, don't do that, love them both, the first thing we think to ourselves is, I don't have any enemies. I'm a modern person. I live in the United States of America. I don't have enemies. I don't hate anyone. But of course you do. Of course you have enemies. When you have a crazy neighbor that sends you a $10,000 demand letter from a lawyer ruining your whole day for stealing dirt, that person is not being friendly to you. That person is saying, I am your enemy. I want to do you harm. I want to do you damage. Over the last year, a lot of us thought we didn't have enemies. Now we have Facebook, and we find out a lot of the people I'm friends with, I don't like these people at all. I can't believe, and just the discussions that have gone on. By the way, if you're a big fan of sharing your political opinions on Facebook, I think you're really convincing people, okay? I think most of us have found that if you just make a well-reasoned argument for the candidate you're voting for, then everyone's pretty much convinced. Like, hey, I was going to vote for my guy, but I think I'm going to vote for your guy now. That works out really good. No, instead, we all hate each other. Yet we tell ourselves when Jesus says, love your neighbors and love your enemies, we say, that doesn't apply to me. I don't have any enemies. But of course you do. You have people who want to do you harm. You have people who don't like you, and they would celebrate if something bad happened to you. And if you're being honest, you might have that in your heart towards someone else. You say, no, I don't, but then you see something happen. You have that little twinge of like, that's your enemy. Ignoring the fact that we have enemies doesn't help. Jesus says, no, once you identify somebody that you can identify as an enemy, you still have to love that person. And it puts us in a difficult situation. I was in Poland a few years ago speaking in schools, and we went to Oskar Schindler's Factory. You remember the Schindler's List? Have you seen that movie? And there was this sign on the wall where they were talking about, they said, you have to close all the seminaries. The Germans were saying, first thing you do is close the Jewish seminaries because these people, they teach the Jewish people to hate the Germans. Of course they do. You're murdering their families. Of course they teach hate. And they were following the commentators who said, yeah, love your neighbors, but hate your enemies. The German people are enemies. Hate them. It's right there. But we all have enemies. And ignoring the fact that we have enemies is not difficult. The thing is that Jesus is asking us to do something difficult. And the Bible is filled with all kinds of things. When we really admit, yes, I have enemies, and I'm supposed to love them, that is actually super hard to do. It's really, really difficult. And the Bible is filled with all kinds of things. You know what? The Bible is filled with all kinds of things that are difficult. And we sometimes, as modern people, we like to say, well, those things are regressive. The Bible seems to talk about men and women are different sometimes. Big surprise, by the way, if you've lived for 10 minutes. But that seems regressive. I shouldn't say that. The Bible talks about sex outside of marriage. It talks about all kinds of sexual identity issues. Those things seem regressive to us. So we say, I'm going to take most of it, but I'm going to remove some parts of it because, those aren't for today. But what we do when we remove the Bible of its most challenging sections, we say we remove all ability for the Bible to change our hearts. If we remove the part that challenges us. Some of you have had a spouse and you go, they're always challenging you. If you have a good spouse, they're always challenging you in a good way. And you could say, I don't want that. I want to just keep living. But you have somebody that knows you the best, that has their finger on you and says, hey, when you did that, that wasn't good. My wife, if she was here speaking, she would say, I like everything you did today, but this thing I don't think connected with people. I didn't like that very much. And I know I'm a very secure person, so I say, thank you very much. She doesn't know what she's talking about, but thank you very much because that's very helpful to me. That's how the Bible is. When Jesus says, listen, you have enemies, guess what? There are real racists in the world, and they want to do you harm. There are people that disagree with you and would celebrate your demise or something bad happening to you. You don't believe it? I watch people online with both Donald Trump and Ruth Bader Ginsburg celebrate those people's death or impending death in the case when Donald Trump got COVID. So we have enemies, and yet the Bible says, Jesus says, you've got to love those people along the way. And for Jesus' day, with most people, kind of already dismissing that part, he says, here's how you define your neighbor. And we get probably the most famous story Jesus ever tells from Luke chapter 10, verse 30 through 37. It says, a man was walking along the road from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked. His attackers nearly beat him to death and took everything he had. They left him for dead on the side of the road, naked and bleeding. But in a stroke of luck, there was a priest traveling to Jericho who came upon him. But when he saw him, he stayed clear and got out of there as quickly as possible. Another deeply religious man came upon the scene and did the same exact thing, leaving him to bleed to death. But then a Samaritan came by, ignoring the danger and the fact that most Samaritans hate Jews. He rendered first aid on the scene. He cleaned and bandaged the injured man's wounds, and then he transported him to a boarding house and tended to him all night. In the morning, the Samaritan had to leave, but he paid the manager to take care of the man while he healed and said, don't worry, if it takes longer than I've paid for, I'll come back and take care of the cost when I come back by. Jesus asked the scholar, well then, what do you think? Which of these men was a true neighbor to the injured man, the one who helped him? The scholar replied. Jesus simply looked at him and said, that's your answer. Do that. That's your answer. Do that. Listen, we know if you've heard this story, and I don't have time to get into all of the background of the story, but you know if you've heard this story, we all know Jews and Samaritans hate each other, okay? If you spent 10 minutes in Sunday school in your life, Jews and Samaritans hate each other. And we go, these racists, what's wrong with these people? Oh, guess what? They had really good reasons for hating each other. Yeah, because when 700 years before, if you ever read the book of Daniel, it tells a story in some of the Old Testament prophecies of the conquering of Israel. They came in and they carried everybody off as slaves, but they left behind farmers because you need food when you're a growing empire. And the Babylonian, the Assyrian Empire left people behind. And those people who stayed there for 70 or 80 years, when they finally were able to re-enter the land and the Jews came back, they found out those people had married the beautiful young daughters and beautiful young men of their enemies, had not only intermarried with them, diluting their blood, but they also had picked up some of their religious practices, including, but not limited to, religious prostitution, child sacrifice, where they would burn children alive to a God of prosperity. And so when they came back, they were horrified and said, listen, you half-breeds have also done away with some of the most important things. How can you mix this stuff with Christianity? And they never got it back together. Even in Jesus' time, 70 years before Jesus was born, the Jews went in and they destroyed the Samaritan temple. About the time of Jesus' birth, the Samaritans came in and defiled the temple in Jerusalem. These people hated each other for good reasons. And you may have heard over the years that, like they say, well, normally, Jesus was traveling through, they wouldn't even go through Samaria because they hate each other. But that's probably not true. Because otherwise you'd have to go out through the desert in Jordan. What's Jordan now? You'd probably die of heat along the way. And the Roman Empire had made it really easy to travel. It's like going from California to Nevada. It's no big deal. So they did not know each other. They didn't hate each other out of xenophobia. They knew each other really well. And they hated each other, even knowing each other really well. It's one thing when you're like, I don't know my neighbor, or I hate this guy. I got to know him, he's actually a pretty good dude. Well, you go over and meet your neighbor and you go, oh, this dude's terrible. I didn't like him when I didn't know him. Now I don't like him even more. That's the story of social media after the last year, right? We're like, I thought I liked all these people. My friends are nuts. What's wrong with them? How could they possibly think what they think? That's the story. I saw a study the other day that when it comes to Republicans and Democrats, that just 15 years ago, about 20% of each group said they had a highly unfavorable view of the other group. But now it's changed where 50% of Republicans have a highly unfavorable view of Democrats. And guess what? 60% of Democrats have a highly unfavorable view of Republicans. So the more we got to know each other, the more we realize we don't like each other. 20% of people say they've lost a close friend over disagreements about COVID-19. Imagine that? An invisible enemy invades, we should all fight it together, and instead, we're at each other's throats. These people knew each other, and they didn't like each other. Okay, really quickly into this story. So there's a couple characters in this story, and we know who we want to identify with in this story. But the first guy that comes along, he's a priest, okay? He's got priestly duties. We say, how can a priest, modern day, it'd be like he's the pastor of a church. How could he leave this guy on the side of the road? Well, for one thing, he's got more important things to do. If he gets in touch with that guy, he can become ceremonially unclean, and all of his priestly duties, he might not be able to do them for weeks before he gets things back together. So he's got to be careful. The next guy comes along as a Levite. This is a guy who's not a priest, but he's involved in the professional religious industry. And when he shows up on the scene, he's got more important things to do. He's got to minister to the masses. He's got to get the work done. He doesn't have time to be distracted by one person when there's so many people that need his help. Plus, these dudes are smart. Do you remember during the Iraq War, we came in, it's no problem taking down a country like that, but it turns out those people don't like it so much when you're in their country. And some of them would set off bombs, but they came up with a really insidious plan. Terrorists would set off one bomb, kill maybe 15, 20 people, emergency services, maybe even the army would come in, and that's when the second bomb would go off and kill hundreds of people. You walk up, you're in the middle of nowhere, there's no police, there's no nothing, and there's a guy bleeding on the side of the road. He has recently been beaten nearly to death. He's bleeding out. He's dying. You don't know where those people are. Maybe they left him there instead of finishing him off and leaving a witness behind. Maybe they decided, hey, leave that guy there, we'll jump the next guy that comes in. It is not callous to move past that person. It's strategic. It's smart. You got to move on. So enter the Samaritan. Samaritan must be walking into this situation going, that dude hates me, probably. Actually, I don't care much for his people either. And this Samaritan, Jesus tells a story, I don't know if you know, but he says, listen, between Jericho and Jerusalem, he's not in Samaritan territory. That is solidly in Jewish territory. We don't know what the Samaritan is up to. It sounds like he was a businessman of some kind. But he knows he is on enemy territory, surrounded by people who would wish his demise. And yet he's the guy that renders aid in that situation. And when Jesus tells this story, the people listening to it, we look at it now and say, you racist, of course, the Samaritan's a good guy. I'm just like the Samaritan. I don't have any of that stuff. I don't have enemies. I love everybody. I'm no racist. I don't know anything. I'm a good guy. And we relate with that guy. But the fact of the matter is, this is an incredibly, incredibly difficult situation. When Jesus says things like love your neighbors, I love the quote of Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher. He says this, the Bible is very easy to understand, but we Christians are a bunch of scheming swindlers. We pretend to be unable to understand because we know very well that the minute we understand, we are obliged to act accordingly. This isn't a difficult story to understand. Somebody needs help. You're supposed to help them. It's not all that complicated. And I get it. We got people filled with intents filled throughout this city, more than 10,000, and they have addiction problems. I get that it's complicated. I'm not trying to simplify things. But the Bible is very clear about our obligation to help the people around us. And yet, it's extremely difficult because I have been the priest, I have been the Levite, and I have been the Samaritan, and so have you. And guess what? It's a lot easier to be the priest and the Levite. And let me tell you something, as a professional minister, I can justify it. I can't get distracted by one person. In 2007, my wife and I finished building our house in Natomas. We bought a barren piece of land and built a house. It's a long story I won't get into. Since that time, we've had 25 people live with us. We have 3 people living with us right now, and a 4th person is moving in with us tomorrow, all of whom we're not related to. This is in addition to my mother-in-law who lives with us. And let me tell you something. Most of those people, they didn't come live with us because things were going great. It was difficult. I've stayed up till 2 o'clock in the morning working with people. I've read leadership books and thought, I'm doing this wrong. I should not be distracted by ordinary individual people. I should be ministering to the masses. I've got the talents and the skills. But the fact of the matter is that God has called us to be Samaritans. And it is difficult, and it is nasty, and if I walk out there tomorrow, I just want to be the priest of the Levite, where I can justify walking by my enemies. But God has called us to something else. And if the worship team wants to come just as we close. I told you about Barney at the beginning. My parents came down. Turns out our little apartment, in addition to being in a bad neighborhood and having a guy who dealt drugs out of the garage next door to us, it also didn't have enough electricity to run an electric dryer. And we didn't have a gas dryer. We couldn't afford to buy a gas dryer. Fortunately, my dad is an electrician, so I asked my parents, hey, could you come down? I talked to the landlord. He said, yeah, I'll buy the parts. He thought, he's getting a good deal, right? We're doing a couple $1,000s worth of electrical work. Just cost him a couple hundred. And my parents were there, and you say, you're a crazy person. Why do you have these people living there? Well, that's the way I grew up. Grew up in a small home, and we had people living with us all the time. We took people out of prison, took people out of mental hospitals, people out of juvenile hall. Some of them were sexual offenders. Some of them were relatives. I can't tell you which one of those is worse. We were in a crazy situation on a regular basis because my parents read the Bible And like Soren Kierkegaard said, can't just ignore what it says because it's easier to explain it away. When the Bible says love your neighbors, we don't need commentators that tell us love your neighbors, but hate your enemies, and then Jesus has to fix it 1,250 years later. So, and I'm not saying we got it perfect. We messed it up all the time. Some of it was really ill-advised. You know, it was ill-advised for this Samaritan, by the way. But my parents came down and they hung out for the weekend, and we were working on it till late. And on Saturday morning, my mom came in the front door of our house, and she said, hey, she said, I met Mary, and she's coming to church with us tomorrow. And I said, Mary who? And my mother looked at me in that way, you know, I was 26 years old. My mother looked at me in that way that you know you're in trouble. You can't tell exactly what you've done wrong, but you know it's going to be bad. And she looked at me, she said, Mary, your next door neighbor. And I realized my mother, you know, she was involved in some strategic maternal shaming. Oh, hey, hotshot minister traveling around the world speaking to people. You don't know your neighbor's name? You lived here for 2 months. And I said, oh, yeah, Mary. And then I thought what she said, Mary is coming to church with us tomorrow. Now, I'm in a situation where the pastor of the church has said, bad neighborhood, bad neighbors, what are you doing in this situation? This is kind of an embarrassment to our church. My parents are going to bring Mary, who doesn't look like she could see the inside of a shower. And I just thought, oh, gosh, this is getting even worse. But I pulled it together and realized I'm a Christian before I'm a pastor. And the next day, Mary showed up at church. I, of course, had to go early. Mary showed up at church with my parents and looked like she had tried to wash her hair, or at least put something in it. It wasn't crazy and all over the place. She was wearing a nice dress. It didn't look like she owned an iron, but she was probably wearing the nicest dress she had. And I went over and said hi to her. I swear to you, I had no idea what she said back to me. I could not understand a word she was saying. My mother is either making it up or she could understand it. I don't know which. But at the end of that service, it was like right now. And you could just kind of feel God's presence there. And a salvation message out there. The radical, transforming message of Jesus was just in the room. And as the pastor said, bow your heads and close your eyes if you'd like to become a Christian. You're away from God. They tell you that, but I just got to tell you, pastors, we all open our eyes. We see. And I looked around, and I saw this little gnarled hand go up in that room, and I just thought, oh, man. And I sat there and just thought, God, help me figure this out. I was just so Levite-y. That Tuesday, there was a knock at the door, and Barney came over. He was wearing, I'm not sure he had anything but the Raiders shirt. He was wearing the Raiders shirt, but his eyes were watering. He said, hey, I don't know if you know Mom was sick. And when he said was, I knew something was up. He said, I went to wake her up this morning. She passed in her sleep peacefully last night. And as he walked away, I thought to myself, you big hot shot. You think you're so great because you can get 1,000 people to come to some outreach that you do. But your neighbor would have died not knowing Jesus if you didn't have a problem with the electricity in your crappy little duplex. And I just sat down. I thought, God, help me. Help me figure it out. I'll end with this. There's one more person in this story. I must have read this story 1 billion times. You must have heard it. When we say, I don't want to be the Levite. I don't want to be the priest. I want to be the Samaritan. But there's a fourth person. See, when Jesus answers back the guy, he says, what must I do to get eternal life? Jesus says, you want to earn it? Here's how you earn it, knowing that it's not possible to earn it. You can't get there. We're all too messed up. We're all too priesty. We're all too Levite-y. Or worse, right? We're not Samaritan-y. He knows. You can't do it. And he answers the story in that way. But Jesus, speaking down through the ages of history, when you really read the story, says, you're not the priest. You're not the Levite. You're not the Samaritan in the story. You are the injured man. You're laying there, bleeding and dying on the side of the road. When your enemy comes up, you say, God is my enemy. Romans 5:10. While we were God's enemies, he made us friends through the death of his son. Surely Now that we are his friends, he will save us through his son's life. God says, your actions, every time I reach out a hand at you, you've slapped it away. Every time I've tried to render first aid, you fight me off. You're laying there bleeding on the side of the road, and even though you've made me your enemy, I've offered you everything. And you mock my name, and you deny me, and your actions and your sin, I know that's not a popular word, but it means something. Your sin has made me your enemy. You've let me know. And yet, I'm here to render first aid. The Samaritan in the story, he says, I'm not just in it, I'm going to keep going. Not just, hey, I'm going to fix you up and send you. Spends the night with them. Then tells the guy, it's cost a lot, but if it costs more, I'll pay that too. That is the story of Christianity. The guy telling this story is going to be tortured to death on the cross for us, for our healing. And he says, I will pay whatever it costs. I will stick through it when no one else can stand you anymore because of your habits. I'll hang in there with you. I'll keep paying. And until you and I see ourselves as that injured man, we'll never, ever be able to really act like that Samaritan did. When we walk by and we see people bleeding on the side of the road, metaphorically or sometimes for real, we go, how did they get themselves in that situation? Which is a way of saying to ourselves, I will never be in that situation because I'm smarter than that. I'm better than that. I wouldn't do that. And Jesus is saying, no. Until you see yourself as injured and bleeding to death on the side of the road, you'll never really get it. You'll never really get it. In the first service, a young man came up to me. I met him afterwards. He said, I got out of a shelter on Thursday. And the other young man that was here with him, he said, yeah, he was going to be out on the streets, but my mom and I took him in. He said, thing is, we're losing our house, and we don't know where we'll be in a couple of weeks. And I said, well, what's the big deal to add a third then? That is the Samaritan mindset. And you only get that when you've been the injured man bleeding and dying on the side of the road, and you say, God, what you've done in me, I want you to do through me. Bow your heads really quickly. God, today in this room, we live in a world where we are at each other's throats. Churches have been torn apart, brother against brother, over whether or not we should wear masks. God, help us. God, until we see ourselves as the injured man in this story, we won't have the humility that it takes. We won't understand. But most of all, God, we'll never be able to receive your salvation. Lord, help us today in Jesus' name. And if you're in this room with your head bowed and your eyes closed, I won't take a long time. Because what happens next is between you and God. But if you're here today and you say, I know I'm away from God. I'm bleeding. I'm hurting. And God has reached down. I've slapped his hands away. Listen, maybe this is your first day back in church, like the young man I met in the first service. Maybe you're watching by live stream. Maybe you've been coming a long time, but you just know you're not where you need to be with God. You've tried everything to get better. You've binged every show on Netflix. You've tried to numb yourself in every way possible. And God is saying, I'm here. If you're at rock bottom, you're in the perfect place to receive mercy, grace, and salvation. And I got to tell you something, you're in the only place. If that's you today, I won't make you do anything. We'll all stand in a second. You know the drill. But between you and God today, you say, hey, that's me. And I want to show God, I know that I'm broken. I know that I'm bleeding. And it's time to get back in the right place with him. Just let me see your hand really quickly across this room. Yeah. Anybody else across this room? You say, include me in this prayer. Yeah. Why don't we all stand up really quickly? If you're at home, I know it's weird if you're at home on the live stream because it's like not really there, but I would just encourage you, just pray this prayer along with us. Say, God, I'm here and I'm broken. And I need your healing. And God, I know I've messed up. I need you to forgive me. I need you to be my Savior. And I put you in charge of my life. God, help me not only stop doing damage to myself, but to be light in this world. God, I thank you for your grace that gives me things I don't deserve. And I thank you for your mercy that doesn't give me the things I do deserve. God, thank you. Thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Lift up my head.